Chaos has erupted live on television. Angela Rayner humiliated, Rachel Reeves in flames, Keir Starmer cornered, and Keti Hopkins smiling as Labour tears itself apart in front of the nation. This was not a debate, not a polite exchange of words, but a total public destruction where every mask was ripped off, every lie exposed, and the so-called Labour dream turned into a nightmare for all to see. The clash that unfolded was raw, shocking, and irreversible. An explosion so fierce that it left Angela Rayner broken, Reeves raging, and Starmer reduced to ashes, while Keti Hopkins delivered a brutal truth that Westminster never wanted you to hear. It all began with Angela Rayner stepping onto the stage, expecting to deliver the usual performance, loud slogans, cheap attacks, and the same hollow promises Labour has repeated for years. She carried herself with the swagger of someone convinced that she could command the room. But within seconds, that illusion was shattered. Keti Hopkins, unapologetic, fierce, and armed with facts that cut like knives, launched into an assault that ripped Rayner's arguments apart piece by piece. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't civil, it was pure devastation. Hopkins didn't just challenge Rayner, she obliterated her, exposing every contradiction, every false promise, and every empty word Labour has used to deceive the British people. Rayner stumbled, her face twisted in frustration as Hopkins refused to play the usual game of polite politics. Instead, Hopkins came prepared with receipts, the broken pledges, the spiralling cards, the chaos inside Labour's leadership. You claim to stand for the working class, Hopkins thundered, but what have you actually delivered? Higher taxes, failed promises, and a party at war with itself. The audience gasped as Rayner fumbled for a response. The silence was deafening. For once, the self-styled fighter of Labour had no fight left. She was exposed, dismantled, and humiliated live for the world to see. But the carnage did not stop there, because while Angela Rayner struggled to breathe under the weight of Hopkins's fury, Rachel Reeves was already standing at the edge of her own destruction. Everyone thought the dust had settled after her explosive fallout with Keir Starmer, the betrayal, the black hole scandal, the press conference that left Westminster reeling, but Reeves had not escaped. The scars of that betrayal were fresh, her rage still burning, and Hopkins knew exactly how to strike the nerve. Rachel Reeves, Hopkins declared, her voice dripping with venom. You knew the numbers didn't add up, you knew the promises were lies, yet you stood beside Starmer and nodded along until the truth was too big to bury. You were not a victim, you were an accomplice. The words landed like a sledgehammer. Reeves, already fragile after weeks of media attacks and whispers of resignation, snapped. She lashed back with fury, accusing Starmer of betrayal, of forcing her into impossible promises, of destroying her credibility to protect himself. The room erupted into chaos as Reeves's anger spilled out once again. The Chancellor, who once built her brand on calm calculation, had become a symbol of unfiltered rage, tearing down her own leader live on air. Labour's unity, already shattered, was reduced to rubble. And then came Keir Starmer himself, the man who styled himself as Britain's safe pair of hands, looked anything but safe as the cameras caught his panic. With Reeves raging, Rayner silenced, and Hopkins exposing every lie, Starmer did what he always does. He tried to shift blame, to spin, to deflect, but Hopkins wasn't having it. She tore into him with brutal clarity. You betrayed your own Chancellor, you humiliated your deputy, and now you expect Britain to trust you with power. This isn't leadership, Keir, it's desperation. The words cut deep, and Starmer's face told the story. He was a man cornered, desperate, and finished. The fallout was instant. Social media exploded with clips of Rayner's silence, Reeves's fury, and Hopkins's merciless attacks. Hashtags trended worldwide. Labour in collapse, Reeves versus Starmer, Rayner humiliated. The headlines wrote themselves. Commentators described it as one of the most brutal political confrontations in living memory. And in the middle of it all was Keti Hopkins, unapologetic, fierce and unrelenting, tearing into Labour with the kind of raw honesty that sent shockwaves across Britain. She didn't just expose their failures, she celebrated their collapse, mocking the so-called unity of Labour as nothing more than a facade, finally crumbling under pressure. But the real question lingered in the air, leaving millions stunned and anxious. If Labour cannot survive the wrath of its own members, if Reeves and Starmer are already at war, and if Angela Rayner can be silenced so easily, then what hope does this party have of leading a nation in crisis? Or is this the beginning of the total destruction of Labour itself? The political battlefield was now drenched in humiliation, and the wounds Labour suffered on live TV were not superficial. They were deep, festering and impossible to hide. The so-called leadership team was exposed in front of millions, Rayner broken, Reeves in open rebellion, and Starmer gasping for survival like a drowning man clinging to a sinking ship. Keti Hopkins, however, wasn't finished. She had only just begun. Her fury turned into a kind of wicked joy, her voice dripping with satisfaction, as she reminded the nation that this chaos wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable collapse of a party built on lies. Keir Starmer promised discipline, she sneered, but what we see tonight is collapse. Rachel Reeves, your own Chancellor, calls you a liar. Angela Rayner, your so-called deputy, cannot defend a single promise. You are finished, Keir. Labour is finished. The words burned like fire across Westminster. Starmer's composure crumbled. He tried to fake a smile, the polished lawyer routine. But the mask was gone. Everyone watching could see the truth. He had lost control. Angela Rayner, desperate to claw back dignity, jumped in with angry soundbites, calling Hopkins a liar, accusing her of spreading hate. But it backfired instantly. Hopkins pounced on her weakness, cutting through her words like a blade. Angela, you shout, you swear, you try to play the tough girl from Stockport, but what have you achieved? Nothing! You stand here pretending to defend the working class while your party stabs its own in the back. You are not tough. You are hollow. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rayner's face flushed red, her voice trembling, her eyes darting towards Starmer for rescue. But he had none to give. Rachel Reeves, meanwhile, was spiralling further. Hopkins's attack on her credibility stung worse than Starmer's betrayal. Reeves had tried to frame herself as the victim, but now the truth was out in the open. She was part of the scam, part of the lie, and the British people knew it. Her fury wasn't only aimed at Starmer anymore, it turned on Hopkins too. But every time Reeves tried to lash out, Hopkins hit back harder, calling her the accountant of collapse, the Chancellor who signed the cheques for Starmer's lies. Reeves looked like a woman torn apart, angry, desperate, humiliated, and the cameras captured every second. Behind the scenes, Labour insiders were panicking. Phones buzzed with frantic calls. MPs sending urgent messages to each other. We can't go into an election like this. Oh, Starmer is finished. Reeves is finished. Rayner is a disaster. Within minutes, whispers of leadership challenges spread like wildfire. Who could replace Starmer? Could Reeves somehow survive and rise from the ashes? Or was this the death spiral of the entire Labour Party? And through it all, Keti Hopkins stood firm, like a predator circling its prey, smiling as Labour ripped itself apart. She mocked their collapse with brutal precision. This is what Labour really is, she spat. Backstabbing, betrayal, weakness. They lied about the economy. They lied about unity. And tonight, they've exposed themselves to the world. Why would Britain trust them with power when they can't even trust each other? The markets trembled again the following morning. International investors, already shaken by the £57 billion black hole, saw the footage of Reeves raging against Starmer and Rayner silenced by Hopkins. And they fled. The pound slid, confidence crumbled, and Britain's political future looked darker by the hour. Commentators described it as a political meltdown of historic proportions. Labour, once certain of victory, was now seen as a party imploding under the weight of its own lies. But the real bombshell had not yet fallen, because in the midst of this chaos, rumours began to swirl that Hopkins had something even bigger, evidence, documents, proof, that could not only finish Starmer, but drag Reeves and Rayner down with him. Whispers in Westminster spoke of a file, a leak, a set of revelations so damning that it would blow the entire scandal wide open. Hopkins's smirk during the broadcast seemed to confirm it. She wasn't just tearing Labour apart for fun. She was holding back something darker, something lethal. And so the nation was left on the edge of its seat, watching as Labour collapsed in real time and wondering, if this is only the beginning, what could Hopkins unleash next? Could she truly finish Starmer, Reeves and Rayner in one devastating move? Or was Britain about to witness a political execution unlike anything seen before? The whispers of a hidden file spread like wildfire. In the corridors of Westminster, in the back rooms of news studios and across the feverish chatter of social media, one question dominated every conversation. What was Keti Hopkins holding back? Her smirk, her ruthless confidence, the way she dismantled Rayner, Reeves and Starmer live on air. It all suggested she had more ammunition, something explosive that could bury Labour once and for all. And the fear inside Labour was unmistakable. They knew Hopkins well enough to understand that she doesn't bluff. When she promised destruction, it usually came with evidence that tore reputations to pieces. Rachel Reeves, once celebrated as Labour's Iron Chancellor, was crumbling before the eyes of the nation. Her fury against Starmer had been seen as rebellion. But Hopkins reframed it as weakness, exposing her as a willing participant in lies that bankrupted trust. Every clip replayed on television reminded the public that Reeves had stood beside Starmer as he sold impossible promises, nodding in agreement, endorsing the disaster. Reeves thought she could rescue herself by blaming Starmer, but Hopkins dragged her deeper into the mud. "You weren't forced, Rachel," Hopkins thundered in one follow-up appearance. "You chose to stand there. You chose to lie, and now Britain pays the price." Reeves's silence in response said it all. She was finished. Angela Rayner's humiliation was even more brutal. The woman who once built her image as Labour's street fighter was left speechless, dismantled and mocked in front of millions. Clips of her stammering and fumbling went viral, captioned with brutal honesty. "This is Labour's deputy leader." Her authority was shredded. Inside Labour circles, MPs whispered that Rayner was now a liability, a clown who couldn't survive a single encounter with Keti Hopkins. She had been exposed not as a fighter, but as a fraud, a politician of slogans, not solutions. And then there was Keir Starmer, the man at the centre of it all. The betrayal of Reeves, the scapegoating, the lies about the £57 billion black hole. Every detail Hopkins ripped open left him more exposed. His mask of control, his robotic calm, his polished lawyer tone, none of it could survive the storm. He looked desperate, broken, cornered, and Hopkins knew it. She mocked him mercilessly. Keir Starmer isn't leading Labour. He's hiding behind it. He isn't running a party. He's running from the truth. And tonight, he has been exposed as the weakest leader Britain has ever seen. The fallout was catastrophic. Polls nosedived. Trust in Labour collapsed. Donors began to waver. Local organisers reported anger boiling among voters who felt deceived. The party, once preparing for government, was now preparing for civil war. Reeves's allies accused Starmer of betrayal. Starmer's loyalists called Reeves a traitor. Rayner's camp insisted she had been ambushed unfairly. Labour, for all its talk of unity, was now a battlefield of knives. And in the middle of this battlefield stood Keti Hopkins, smiling like a queen, watching enemies destroy each other. But the rumours about the file kept growing louder. Insiders whispered about documents showing secret deals, promises to investors, warnings ignored, and even emails that revealed just how far Starmer and Reeves were willing to go to bury the truth. Hopkins refused to confirm or deny, only smiling in interviews and saying, "You haven't seen anything yet." That one line was enough to send Westminster into panic mode. What if she really had it? What if she dropped it just before the election? What if she could prove that Labour not only lied, but planned to deceive Britain deliberately? The fear was so intense that Starmer reportedly held an emergency meeting late into the night with his closest advisers. Reeves was absent. Rayner wasn't invited. Trust had collapsed, even within the inner circle. If she has the documents, one insider admitted, "We're finished." But the damage was already done. Hopkins didn't need to release the file immediately. The mere suggestion that she had it was enough to poison Labour's credibility beyond repair. The chaos spilled into the media. Headlines screamed about Labour's collapse. Commentators called it the end of the party's credibility. Clips of Hopkins destroying Labour figures replayed endlessly. She had become the voice of brutal truth, a figure both feared and celebrated, unfiltered and unrelenting. Love her or hate her, no one could deny that she had dismantled Labour in a way no Tory ever could. And yet the cliffhanger grew sharper with every passing hour. If Hopkins really had the evidence, why hadn't she released it yet? Was she waiting for the perfect moment, the killing blow, before the election? Or was she enjoying watching Labour squirm, drawing out their collapse, making them bleed slowly until the final strike? The reaction was instant and volcanic. News channels dropped everything to cover the leak. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators who once defended Starmer now admitted the obvious: he had lied. Reeves's rebellion no longer looked like hysteria, it looked like survival. Rayner's humiliation was sealed. Her loyalty to Starmer marked her as complicit. Labour, the party that promised competence, integrity and honesty, now stood naked as a machine of lies, betrayal and self-preservation. And in the centre of it all was Keti Hopkins, triumphant, unapologetic, revelling in the destruction. Britain has been betrayed, Hopkins declared, her voice cutting through the noise like steel. Starmer lied, Reeves lied, Rayner lied, and tonight the proof is here. This is not leadership, this is fraud, this is corruption, and the British people will never forgive them. The words echoed across television screens, phones and radios. For millions watching, it felt like a political execution in real time. Reeves, the once loyal Chancellor, was branded as the enabler of collapse. Rayner was mocked as the loudmouth turned coward. And Starmer, the self-styled saviour of Labour, was reduced to rubble. His credibility obliterated in one night. Markets tumbled further. Investors pulled out in panic. Labour MPs erupted in open revolt, calling for Starmer's resignation. Leadership plots multiplied, each faction sharpening their knives, and ordinary voters, watching from their living rooms, asked the question that cut deeper than any headline. If this is how Labour governs itself, what would they do to the country? Starmer tried to fight back. He called the leaks misrepresented. He insisted Hopkins was twisting the truth. But the damage was irreversible. The documents spoke louder than his excuses. Reeves refused to defend him. Rayner stayed silent, hiding from cameras. The once mighty Labour leadership team was fractured, leaderless, finished. Hopkins, meanwhile, poured salt into the wounds. She laughed at Labour's downfall, calling it the greatest unmasking in British politics. She celebrated Reeves's fury, mocked Rayner's weakness, and ripped Starmer apart as a coward clinging to power. She reminded Britain that Labour's collapse wasn't caused by her, but by themselves, by their lies, their arrogance, their betrayal of the very people they claimed to represent. And so the meltdown was complete. Labour was no longer just wounded, it was bleeding out in public, exposed, humiliated, collapsing under its own weight. Reeves stood isolated, Starmer stood disgraced, Rayner stood broken, and Hopkins stood tall, smiling at the ruins. This was more than a scandal. This was a political earthquake that would define Britain for years to come. But as the dust settled, one question loomed darker than the rest. If Keti Hopkins could do this to Labour in a single night, if she could destroy Reeves, Rayner and Starmer with one brutal strike, then what happens next? Was this the end of Labour as a serious force in British politics? Or was this only the beginning of an even bigger collapse that could shatter Westminster itself?